During a black tie charity gala at one of Chicago's most prestigious hotels, a wealthy widower prepares to close the most important deal of his career over dinner. While his business partner steps away to take a call, a scruffy boy in an oversized coat slips past security and whispers to the man, "Sir, she put something in your drink." Acting on instinct, the man quietly switches his glass with his partner's. 2 hours later, everything changes. The evening had begun the way all of Walter Haynes's evenings began these days, with purpose and without warmth. He straightened his bow tie in the elevator's mirrored wall as it ascended to the Marquette room on the 43rd floor of the Aldridge Hotel. Watching his own reflection with a detached appraisal of a man who had long since stopped expecting to be surprised by anything. 61 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that came not from confidence, but from decades of never allowing himself to slouch. His real estate development company, Haynes Capital Group, had transformed 3 Midwestern cities in the past decade. His name was on libraries, children's wings of hospitals, and the occasional mayor's lips at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Tonight, he was here for Sylvia Croft. Not romantically, Walter had buried that part of himself alongside his wife, Nora, 4 years ago. Sylvia was his co-investor on a $340 million mixed-use development in the River North District, and tonight's gala, the Chicago Children's Literacy Foundation annual dinner, was where they would sign the final letter of intent over dessert, a formality, his attorneys had assured him. Everything was in order. He found Sylvia already seated at their reserved table near the window, the city lights of Chicago spreading below like a second sky. She was 53, immaculately dressed in a champagne gown, with the kind of smile that had made her one of the most successful private equity managers in the Midwest. They exchanged pleasantries about the keynote speaker, agreed the salmon was overdone, and laughed at a story a mutual colleague told about a disastrous deal in Phoenix. Walter felt comfortable with Sylvia. That was precisely the word, comfortable. He trusted her the way he trusted his attorney, his cardiologist, his driver of 11 years, professionally and without question. When the salad plates were cleared, Sylvia excused herself. "I need to take this call from my Tokyo office. 5 minutes, I promise." Walter nodded and reached for his water glass, then changed his mind and poured 2 fingers of the scotch that had been placed before him. He gazed out at the city. Somewhere below, the Chicago River bent its dark path through the streets. He thought, as he sometimes did at quiet moments, about Nora, about how she would have hated this kind of event, would have spent the whole dinner making quiet, wicked observations about the other guests, until he had to hide his laughter behind his napkin. He was still smiling faintly at the memory when a commotion broke the low murmur of the room. A boy appeared at the edge of the table. He couldn't have been older than 11. He wore a puffy coat 2 sizes too large, patched at one elbow with silver duct tape, and sneakers so worn they'd lost any identifying color. His dark hair was matted on one side, as if he'd been sleeping against something rough, and his eyes, brown, very alert, slightly too old for his face, moved quickly around the table before landing on Walter. A security guard was already 3 steps behind him. "Sir," the boy said, his voice low and urgent, barely above the ambient noise of the room. He was looking directly at Walter's scotch. "Don't drink that. The lady put something in it." Walter stared at him. "She went to the bar before she sat down." The boy continued, words tumbling fast. "I was by the service door. I saw her. She took something out of her purse and put it in the glass on the left. That one." He pointed briefly at the scotch. The security guard arrived with an apologetic murmur and a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Haynes." He slipped in through the kitchen corridor. "We'll have him removed immediately." "Wait," Walter said. But the boy was already being turned away, and Walter caught only his parting words over the ambient noise of the room. "I'm not lying, sir, I swear." Then he was gone. Walter sat very still. Around him the gala continued without pause. Silverware clinked. A woman laughed across the room. The string quartet in the corner moved from Vivaldi to something slower. He looked at the scotch glass. He thought about the boy's eyes. He thought about the particular quality of desperation in them. Not the desperation of someone wanting something, but the desperation of someone trying to prevent something. He thought about Sylvia, who had suggested this scotch specifically when they'd discussed the menu last week. "The Aldridge keeps a 22-year Glenfiddich for private events. You'd love it, Walter." He thought about the Tokyo call, which had come at a very convenient moment before dessert. Walter Haynes had built his career on reading rooms, reading deals, reading people. He had walked away from a $90 million partnership in 2018 because something in his gut had whispered wrong and he had been right. He looked at the scotch one more time. Then, with movements so deliberate they appeared casual, he lifted the glass and set it at Sylvia's place. He poured himself water. When Sylvia returned 4 minutes later, she settled into her chair with a seamless smile and reached immediately for her drink. Tokyo is a 12-hour time difference, and somehow they always manage to call at exactly the wrong moment. She took a long sip of the scotch. Anyway, shall we order dessert and get these papers signed? Let's, Walter agreed, his voice perfectly even. 12 minutes later, Sylvia Croft set down her dessert fork and pressed 2 fingers to her temple. Headache? Walter asked. Strange one, she said. Came out of nowhere. Her hand, reaching for the water glass, was not entirely steady. By the time Walter had reviewed the letter of intent with theatrical slowness, asking questions he already knew the answers to, requesting a pen from a passing waiter, commenting on a clause he had approved weeks ago, Sylvia's color had changed, a faint perspiration at her hairline, a slight unfocusing of her eyes. Sylvia, he set down the document. You don't look well. I'm fine, she said, but the word came out slightly thick. Her hand went to her clutch. She checked her phone with fumbling fingers. Walter caught a fragment of a message on the screen before she tilted it away. Why is it taking so long? In that moment, Walter understood. He raised his hand for the maitre d' and requested medical assistance with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. What followed was controlled chaos. Hotel staff, then paramedics, then Sylvia on a stretcher, murmuring that she was fine, that this was unnecessary, casting one look at Walter that contained something he had never seen in her face before. Not confusion, not embarrassment, something that looked unmistakably like calculation dissolving into panic. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Walter provided a precise account to the attending physician, and then, separately, to a detective named Okafor from the Chicago PD. He surrendered his own scotch glass, which he'd had discreetly bagged by the hotel manager before leaving, as potential evidence. He described the boy. He described what the boy had said. You believed a child who ran in off the street, Okafor said. It wasn't quite a question. I believed his eyes, Walter said. He sat in the waiting room for 90 minutes, fielding calls from his legal team, before Okafor returned with a different posture, the posture of a detective whose skepticism had just been replaced by something more serious. Toxicology found a compound in Miss Croft's blood work, Okafor said, plant-derived, enough to cause cardiac irregularities in a man your age and weight within about 90 minutes of ingestion, possibly longer to be traced to anything other than a cardiac event. He paused. She's stable. She's also asking for a lawyer. Find the boy, Walter said. He's a witness. He may be a street kid, somewhere near the hotel, near the service entrance. Okafor nodded. We'll look. You should know. The hotel's kitchen security footage confirms someone matching that description near the service corridor around 9:45. Walter drove home through streets slick with November rain. He sat in the back of his car and thought about the boy's coat. The duct tape at the elbow, the particular angle of tired resignation in the way he'd stood before the guard grabbed him. That wasn't a child looking for attention. That was a child who had learned to observe, quietly and invisibly, because invisibility was how he survived. Walter had a lot of money and a great many resources. He also had, his late wife had always told him, a stubborn streak that expressed itself most clearly when he felt something was right. He picked up his phone and called his head of security. I need to find a boy, he said. 11 or 12, dark hair, oversized coat with silver duct tape on the left elbow. Start near the Aldridge. Check the shelters. It took until morning. His security team located the boy at a drop-in center on West Chicago Avenue. At 7:15 a.m., Walter arrived at 8, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate in a paper tray, which he acknowledged was perhaps an unusual opening move, but which felt correct. The boy was sitting at a table near the window with a paper cup of orange juice and a wariness that filled the room. When he saw Walter, his first instinct was clearly to run. Walter sat down across from him without asking permission and set one of the hot chocolates on the table. You told me the truth last night, Walter said. I switched the glass. I'd like to know your name. The boy studied him for a long time. Benji, he finally said. How old are you, Benji? 11. A pause. Almost 12. How long have you been on your own? Benji wrapped both hands around the hot chocolate and said nothing, which was its own answer. Walter didn't push. He had learned, in his years of negotiating, that silence was not always the enemy. Sometimes it was the space where trust began to breathe. You took a risk last night, he said instead. You could have ignored what you saw. Most people would have. Benji looked out the window at the grey November street. She looked at you when she put it in your drink, he said, like she wanted to see what would happen. It wasn't an accident. He paused. People shouldn't look at each other like that. The simplicity of the moral logic struck Walter like a bell. This child, who owned nothing, who slept in drop-in centers and survived on discarded food and whatever scraps the city offered, this child had run a calculation in which a stranger's life outweighed his own safety, and the calculation had taken approximately 0 seconds. The police are going to need your account of what you saw, Walter said. A formal statement. I want you to know I'll make sure you're protected while that happens. A lawyer, a child advocate, whatever you need. Benji's expression closed slightly. They'll put me in the system, not if I can prevent it. I'd like to make a proposal. Walter wrapped both hands around his own cup. For the next few days while the police investigate, I have a guest room, clean, private, with a door that locks from the inside. You'd have meals, you'd have space, and no one would pressure you to do anything you don't agree to. He met the boy's eyes. 3 days, your terms. After that, we figure out the rest together. Benji stared at him. You don't know me. You didn't know me either, Walter said. Last night didn't stop you. Something shifted in the boy's face. Not trust, not yet. But the first molecular precursor to it. 3 days, Benji said finally. Then I decide. Then you decide, Walter agreed. Walter's home was a 4-story townhouse in Lincoln Park, a block from the lake. It had been redesigned by Nora over 5 years of enthusiastic and occasionally catastrophic renovation, and contained, among other things, a library with a rolling ladder, a kitchen that could have served a small restaurant, and a guest room on the 3rd floor that had belonged, in the last years of her life, to Nora's mother. Benji stood in the doorway of that room and didn't move for a long moment. It's a lot, Walter acknowledged from the hallway. You don't have to like it. You just have to be comfortable. There's a window seat, Benji said. Yes, with a cushion. My wife picked the fabric. Benji crossed the room and sat on the window seat, looking out at the narrow courtyard below, where a garden had gone to its November bones. He sat there for several minutes without speaking. Walter waited in the doorway, understanding without being told that this was a boy processing the concept of a space that belonged to no one who would take it away. Eventually, Benji turned. What was her name, your wife? Nora. Was she nice? She was the most honest person I have ever known, Walter said. Which is not always the same thing as nice, but it's better. Benji considered this. My mom was honest, he said very quietly. She died when I was 9. Cancer. I'm sorry. After that it was my uncle for a while. Then he lost his job and lost the apartment, and then there wasn't room for me. Benji's voice was flat and recitative, the way a child's voice gets when a story has been told so many times internally it has worn smooth. That was 8 months ago. 8 months. Walter did the arithmetic without showing it on his face. 8 months on Chicago streets in late winter, through summer, into this gray November. 11 years old. He thought about Nora, who had spent the last decade of her life on the board of 3 children's organizations, and who had a particular fury, quiet and absolute, for systems that failed children. He thought about what she would say to him right now, and he was fairly certain he already knew. Get some rest, he said. Detective Okafor is coming at 2 this afternoon with a child advocate. You don't have to say anything you don't want to say. I'll be there the whole time. Detective Okafor arrived with a woman named Ms. Reyes, a child advocate with calm eyes and a gift for making official proceedings feel like conversations. Benji sat across from them in Walter's living room and answered questions with a precision that clearly surprised both of them. Times, specific details about the angle of Sylvia's body, the specific gesture of her hand at the drink, the words she had exchanged with someone on her phone in the lobby 40 minutes before dinner, that Benji had overheard because he'd been near the hotel's side entrance trying to stay warm. You heard her make a call? Okafor asked. She said it'll be in the glass, not the food, Benji said. He always orders scotch. Just make sure the table setting is right, He paused. I didn't know what that meant then, but then I saw her at the bar. Okafor and Ms. Reyes exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. When they were leaving, Okafor pulled Walter into the hallway. The compound in Ms. Croft's blood work has been identified. It's unscheduled, synthetic but derived from a plant compound used in several countries. Not easy to source. We're looking at premeditation here, possibly connected to a broader financial dispute. He lowered his voice further. Her business records are showing some irregularities. Transfers to offshore accounts over the past 8 months. Your deal would have made you her largest secured creditor. If you'd died before signing, the letter of intent would have dissolved, and she'd have retained certain assets that are currently listed as collateral. Walter absorbed this with the stillness of a man who had survived 61 years by processing bad news without theater. Okafor's pause was answer enough. We're looking into 2 other cases, both single, high-net-worth individuals. Both experienced cardiac events in the past 18 months. Both survived, barely. Walter went back into the living room, where Benji had accepted a bowl of soup from Walter's housekeeper, Gordon, and was eating it with the focused, slightly sideways attention of someone who has learned to be grateful without appearing vulnerable. You did well, Walter told him. Benji looked up. Did I tell them enough? More than enough. The boy nodded slowly and went back to his soup, and Walter looked at the November light coming through the window and thought about probability. The specific, staggering improbability of an 11-year-old boy being near a hotel service entrance on precisely the right evening, observing precisely the right thing, and choosing, against every incentive of self-preservation, to act on it. The 3 days became a week, not through negotiation or persuasion, but through the gradual accumulation of ordinary moments. Benji discovered the library on the second morning and spent 4 hours working through a book on astronomy, which led to a conversation over dinner that lasted 2 hours and ended with Walter pulling out Nora's old telescope from the hall closet and setting it up in the courtyard despite the cold. Benji fell asleep at the table afterward, and Gordon had quietly covered him with a blanket, and Walter had stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment before going to bed himself. The week became 2 weeks. Dr. Okafor called with updates. Sylvia Croft had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. The network she had been part of, small, careful, targeting wealthy individuals with minimal family connections, was beginning to unravel. 2 other individuals were in custody. Walter's name was removed from any further list of concerns. Through all of it, Benji observed. He was not an effusive child. He didn't fill silences with chatter, didn't perform gratitude or cheerfulness. But he noticed things. He noticed when Gordon's back was bothering him and quietly brought in the grocery bags without being asked. He noticed that Walter ate lunch at his desk and always forgot to eat enough and began, with no comment, to bring a second bowl of whatever he was eating to the office doorway and set it there until Walter acknowledged it. He noticed that Walter kept a photograph of Nora on the bookshelf in a frame that had been turned very slightly away from the room, as if it were too much to look at directly, and he never mentioned it, but he also never looked at it when Walter could see him. He was, Walter thought, a remarkably decent person, not a remarkable child, a remarkable person. The conversation about what came next happened on a Sunday evening in early December, 3 weeks after the gala. They were in the library, Benji with his astronomy book, Walter reviewing documents, the radiator clicking its familiar rhythm against the first real cold of winter. Dr. Okafor said I should probably talk to someone from DCFS, Benji said without looking up from his book. He mentioned it to me too, Walter said. Foster care, Benji said. The words had no inflection. They didn't need any. That's one option, Walter said carefully. He set down his pen. I've spoken with an attorney about another option. Guardianship, while we work out the longer questions. It would mean you stay here, get enrolled in school in January, and nobody makes any permanent decisions until you and I both have time to decide what we actually want. Benji looked up from his book. His expression was the one Walter had come to recognize. Not hope, exactly, but the careful inspection of something that might be hope before committing to it. Why would you do that? Because this house has been very quiet for 4 years, Walter said. And I think Nora would have had strong opinions about a child sleeping in drop-in centers on Chicago Avenue. You can't know what she would have thought. I knew her for 31 years. I have a fairly good sample size. Benji's mouth did something that was almost a smile. Do you think she'd have liked me? She had no patience for dishonesty or self-pity, and a great deal of patience for intelligence and stubbornness, Walter said. So yes, enormously. The boy was quiet for a moment. Outside, Sleet tapped at the window. Okay, he said finally. Guardianship, but I want to be the one who talks to the DCFS person. Not you talking for me, agreed, Walter said immediately. And I want to keep my own name, Benjamin Osei. He said it with a particularity that told Walter it was the one thing he'd held on to. I'm not changing it. I wouldn't ask you to. Benji turned back to his astronomy book. After a moment he said without looking up, The Aldridge throws out really good food on weekend nights. I used to eat there sometimes, after the kitchen closed. I know, Walter said. I called the hotel manager. He's agreed to have the kitchen package leftovers for a shelter on Wabash on Friday nights. Gordon will handle the transport. Benji looked up at him then, fully, with an expression Walter couldn't quite name but felt somewhere behind his sternum. You already did that? Benji said. This week, yes. Benji returned to his book, but his shoulders had dropped from the position they usually held, the unconscious brace of a child who has learned to wait for things to be taken away. They navigated the legal process with what Walter's attorney described as unusual smoothness, attributable in roughly equal measure to Walter's resources, Benji's clear and consistent testimony, and a DCFS caseworker named Ms. Adeyemi, who had spent 22 years working with children in unstable situations and who told Walter in their first meeting that she could tell the difference between a charitable impulse and a genuine commitment, and that she intended to determine which one this was. She came to the house 4 times over 6 weeks. She sat with Benji alone. She reviewed the library of documentation Walter's team had prepared. She watched the way Walter and Benji existed in the same room, not with manufactured warmth, but with the particular ease of 2 people who had found each other's rhythms without trying. On her 4th visit, she told Walter, he trusts you. Kids who've been through what he's been through don't trust easily or perform trust convincingly. What I see in that boy when he looks at you is real. She paused. I'm recommending approval. Benji started at a school 4 blocks from the townhouse in January, a mid-sized K-8, where the principal had been briefed in general terms on the unusual nature of his enrollment. He was placed in 6th grade, a year behind by age, which he accepted with the pragmatism of someone accustomed to making peace with things outside his control. He had gaps, long ones, in math and formal writing. He had a knowledge of astronomy, street navigation, human behavior, and practical survival that his teachers did not know how to grade. His closest friend by February was a girl named Temperance who went by Tempe and who had, according to Benji's nightly debriefs, an extraordinary ability to argue any position and a weakness for bad puns. She sounds like Nora, Walter said one evening. Benji thought about this. Maybe, he said. She's funnier though. Don't let her hear you say that about someone you haven't met. Benji looked at the photograph on the bookshelf, the first time he had looked at it directly while Walter was watching. Do you think she can hear things? Walter considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think she had a way of knowing things she shouldn't have been able to know, he said. I've decided to assume that hasn't changed. It was on a Tuesday evening in March, 5 months after the gala at the Aldridge, that Benji knocked on the door of Walter's office. He was holding a sheet of paper, a school assignment, Walter could see, and he had the look he got when he'd been working something out for a while. I have to write about someone who influenced me, Benji said. For language arts, who did you choose? Benji sat down in the chair across the desk and put the paper on his knee. My mom, he said. She used to say that the way you know who someone really is by what they do when no one is watching. He paused. I was watching that night at the hotel. She put something into your drink when she thought no one could see her. And you switched the glass when you thought no one was watching. He looked at Walter. That's how I knew you were safe. Walter was quiet for a moment. Your mother sounds like she was very wise. She was. Benji straightened the paper on his knee. I put you in the essay too, as a secondary figure. Secondary, Walter repeated. My teacher said focus on one main person, of course. A small silence. I told her you were good at doing the right thing when no one was watching, Benji said, in the particular tone of someone conveying something important by sideways approach. She said that was the best definition of character she'd heard this year. Walter looked at this boy, this careful, observant, improbably decent boy who had walked into a room full of security guards and Chicago's most influential philanthropists to warn a stranger, and who had spent 5 months quietly and without ceremony, becoming the most important person in Walter Haynes's life, and felt something that he hadn't expected to feel again after Nora. Not grief's opposite, exactly. Something quieter. The specific warmth of a life that had, against considerable odds, found its center again. "Benjamin," he said. Benji looked up. Walter never used his full name. "Thank you," Walter said simply, "for what you did that night, and for everything since." Benji's expression went through several things quickly and then settled. "You already thanked me," he said. "At the drop-in center. I know. I'm thanking you again." Benji considered this, then turned back to his paper. "You can be a footnote," he said, "in the essay. If you want, I would be honored," Walter said, and meant it entirely. 6 months after formal guardianship was granted, on a Thursday in late spring when the lake had finally shifted from gray to that particular shade of deep blue that Chicagoans spend all winter waiting for, Walter and Benji ate lunch at a counter-stool diner on North Clark Street that Benji had discovered by following his nose one Saturday morning. It was the kind of place with laminate menus and coffee served in thick white mugs, and a regular clientele who all seemed to know each other, and the owner, a woman named Pat who had forearms like a linebacker and kept a jar of peppermint candies on the counter, had taken one look at Benji on his first visit and given him the corner stool and a free order of toast. They ate. Walter had the eggs. Benji had the pancakes, as he always did. Near the end of the meal, a girl came in, maybe 13, wearing a school uniform jacket with a torn pocket, carrying a backpack with one strap fixed with electrical tape. She sat 2 stools down and looked at the menu for a long time without ordering, the way someone looks at a menu when they're calculating whether they can afford anything on it. Benji glanced at Walter. Walter gave a small nod. Benji turned to the girl. "The pancakes are good," he said, with the particular nonchalance of someone delivering important information casually. "Pat always makes extra batter on Thursdays. Usually goes to waste." The girl looked at him sideways. "I have money," she said, with the exact tone Benji himself had used 6 months ago. "I know," Benji said. "I'm just saying the pancakes are good." He turned back to his own plate. Walter paid the check and included a note to Pat about covering whatever the girl at the counter ordered. When they left, Walter held the door. Outside on North Clark, the spring air smelled like Lake Michigan and something green and possible. "You handled that well," Walter said. Benji walked beside him, hands in his pockets. "She reminded me of me," he said. Before you got here, before I remembered that people can surprise you." He looked up at the light coming off the lake. "My mom used to say most people are trying their best with what they have. I forgot that for a while. Being hungry makes you forget things." He paused. She would have liked Pat's pancakes. Walter thought about Nora, who would have known what to say in this exact moment. He thought about the improbable chain of events that had led from a charity gala on the 43rd floor of the Aldridge Hotel to this sidewalk, this light, this boy. "What do you think she would have ordered?" he asked. Benji considered this seriously. "Eggs," he said. "And she would have talked to Pat for 20 minutes about the recipe." Sounds right. They walked toward home through the spring afternoon, and Benji told him about the girl Tempe's theory that space travel would eventually make national borders meaningless, which had apparently led to an argument in social studies that their teacher had tried and failed to stop for 11 minutes. And Walter listened and asked questions, and the lake light moved across the city like a benediction. Somewhere along the way, Benji's hand found Walter's for exactly 1 block, the way it sometimes did, quickly and without comment, before releasing, and Walter accepted it the way he'd learned to accept everything about this child, without surprise, without analysis, with only the quiet and absolute understanding that some things in this world find their way to where they belong, and all you have to do is not be too foolish to let them in.